The storm was merciless. Snow clawed at the windows like a living beast, and in the frozen silence of an alien world, a lone human soldier waited. He had come here to disappear, to bury the echoes of war, the screams, the orders, the weight of survival. Humanity to the galaxy was small, fragile, a dying ember lost among the stars. But for him, that ember still burned, even if it only lit the walls of his cabin. Then came the knock, not thunder, not the howl of the wind. A sound no soldier could mistake, a hand, a plea. When he opened the door, the storm nearly ripped the world in two, and yet 3 figures stood in the blizzard. An alien woman, her skin the color of frost, and 2 children clinging to her legs. Their lips were blue, their eyes empty with hunger. Her words were not seductive, not bargaining, they were desperate. "Only a human can save my children." And in that moment, a man who had sworn never to fight again realized the galaxy wasn't finished testing him. Because sometimes the smallest ember is all it takes to set fire to the dark. "Soldier, stay with me. The mission begins now." Before the knock, before the storm tore the night apart, life on Veltuan 5 was measured in quiet routines. Elric Ward, once captain, once soldier, now exile, kept to his rituals as if order could shield him from memory. Every morning he stoked the heat core, its faint hum the closest thing to company. He brewed weak tea from leaves he rationed, with the discipline of a battlefield quartermaster. And he sat at the same chair by the same window, staring into a wasteland of endless snow. To the galaxy he was forgotten. To himself he was just waiting. He checked the solar panels when the storms allowed, patched the cabin's cracks with scraps of old military canvas, scribbled notes into a worn logbook no one would ever read. It was survival, yes, but it was also a habit. Because if his hands kept busy, his mind might not wander back to the trenches, to the cries that never stopped echoing. The silence was heavy, but it was predictable. And predictable, in a universe that thrived on chaos, was a kind of hope. Yet even in the silence, danger lingered. Sometimes the wind carried more than snow. Once he swore he saw shadows moving at the tree line, though trees had not grown here in centuries. Once he found strange tracks half buried near his supply cache, too large for any animal he knew. And every so often, the comms array picked up whispers on dead channels, fragments of languages, half-jammed transmissions that cut off the moment he tuned in. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind, just ghosts in the static. But he still kept the revolver polished, its grip worn smooth from old battles. He still kept his pack ready, half food, half ammo, and a photograph of the squad he'd buried long ago. And every night as the storm raged, he would close his eyes and swear he heard footsteps outside the cabin. Not human, not quite alien, just waiting. The universe had left him to his solitude, yet solitude had never felt so fragile. Elric's only tether to humanity was memory, and memory was a cruel companion. Sometimes he replayed the moment his squad fell. Sometimes he remembered a child's voice he would never hear again. And sometimes, in the stillness of a frozen dawn, he imagined what it would be like if someone, anyone, knocked on his door. But no one ever did. So he lived with the silence. He lived with the ghosts. He lived as though the world had ended. And he was the last ember burning against the cold. Until the night came when the storm was louder than usual. Until the hum of the heater was swallowed by a roar that shook the walls. Until he heard the sound he thought would never come. 3 faint knocks, half drowned in the blizzard's fury. It was not thunder. It was not the wind. It was the sound of a new story breaking through the silence. "Brace yourself, soldier. The storm carries more than snow tonight." For a few days, the world inside the cabin felt like a breathing thing. Small, fragile, but stubbornly alive. Mazari moved through the space with quiet purpose. Tiva made drawings out of charcoal and found reasons to laugh. Cello carved little soldiers from scrap wood, and, in the thin light that filtered through frost, Elric found himself teaching the boy how to whittle without losing a finger. The heater hummed. The stew simmered. Routine stitched their ragged lives together. Outside, the storm slithered at the edges of that warmth. It never slept, and the things that moved in the snow were patient. The first sign was small, a smear in the snow near the supply cache, half buried and wrong, tracks too regular to be animal. A metallic glint the size of a fingernail where some scanner had scraped the crust away. Elric found the marks with hands that had once read battlefields like maps. He tasted cold fear and swallowed it down. That night, the comms hissed a language he didn't know. Not quite alien, a crooked hybrid of drones calling to one another. He listened until the static ripped the signal away. Whatever was out there, it was scanning, mapping, waiting. Then the lights came. It began as a far smear on the horizon, then a line, then a circle of cold white that moved on the snow like a great searching eye. Drones, Elric thought, harvester seekers. Not the kind that hunted animals, the kind that stripped life down to its inventory. They smelled of circuitry and law. They were efficient and patient, and they carried judgment in their lenses. Mazzari felt it before she heard it. She pressed Tiva's head to her chest and breathed through the child's hair as if she could breathe the storm away. Cello stiffened, listening with that wary, folded attention children learn quickly when the world teaches them to be small. Elric checked the locks. He checked his revolver. He checked for panic, and in the hollow where panic should have been, he found something colder, calculation. The first patrol struck like the cutting edge of winter. Steel boots across packed snow, a scanner's pulse through the air, a voice, not human, that called in clipped orders. When the first drone swept the cabin, its floodlight painted the heater in a hard white. Tiva started, hands clamped on her doll. The machine's lens lingered on footprints, on a blanket, on the faint human scent used like a signature. The world seemed to narrow to the beam. Elric made a choice that was old and guttural. He put the children in the small storeroom beneath the floor and covered the vent. He told Mazzari to keep them breathing and to be very, very quiet. Then he walked to the door and waited with the kind of patience a man learns by knowing how many seconds a grenade will take. They knocked first, a rumble against reinforced composite. Not a polite knock, a percussion test. When he opened the hatch, a slit. The cold poured in and painted his face blue. On the ridge stood a line of enforcement. 3 units in the first wave, their armor reflecting the storm like knives. One brought a scanner down to his face and the screen spat back a sterile verdict. Refugee signature confirmed, the machine intoned. Unauthorized habitation. Stand aside! Elric could have closed the door. He could have left the cabin to its engines and watched the world decide. He had done nothing for months, but the children were below his floorboards. He lied. No one here but me, he said. His voice was low. They were trained to hear lies. The armor made a small noise, almost a laugh. Open, the lead said. Its voice was a layered chorus. Authority without empathy. We will inspect. Comply and you will be processed. He opened. They pushed inside with efficient rudeness. Sweeping drones mapping, thermal probes tasting the corners. Their software flagged the heater as inefficient. The food cache is substandard. The cabin is a harbor. One of them reached for the storeroom hatch. Hand mechanized, the fingers like a harvest claw. Elric moved faster than thought. Instinct, muscle memory, a life spent on the edge. He struck the claw with the butt of his revolver. Metal rang. For a heartbeat, the machine staggered, a shock to its balance. A thoughtless mechanical recoil. And in that crack, he slammed the hatch and shoved the bolt. The alarm screamed. The enforcement units were not designed for surprise. They recalculated and retaliated with a cold efficiency that made Elric taste iron. One of them fired a non-lethal burst that blew out the outer vent and sent splinters across his table. The heater hiccuped. The comms array went dead. The solar panels took a shot. The storm outside cheered with a new fury as the cabin's defenses flickered. Mazzari's face was pale but locked. Tiva clutched her doll and whispered, "Is it the ones who take?" Cello's jaw clenched. Elric's heart thudded like an old drumbeat. He felt something like shame and then the hot spike of anger. Not just at the machines, but at the order that had birthed them. At the system that called a widow and her children a liability and a thing to be cataloged. They left the first wave encircled, lights withdrawing like predatory eyes. But the warning stayed, a small device pinned to the doorframe, a locator. A mark someone would return. They always did. That night, Elric walked the perimeter, in the white light of the heater, and felt his hands remember every scavenged trick. He rigged false trails, scraped footprints to the east, layered them over old animal tracks, seeded the snow with odd metallic flakes that would confuse scanners. He dug a shallow trap line and laid a jury-rigged EMP, old capacitors paired with the dead comm array. It might buy a moment. Moments could save lives. They came back at dawn, faster, with numbers. The first wave had been a probe. This was enforcement with teeth, hover vehicles beyond anything. Elric had seen in the war, low and humming, their undersides glowing like the bellies of things that had been born in starship factories. The line of lights on the ridge was no longer 3. It braided into a dozen. Figures moved like a tide. Elric watched from the window as the world outside he knew. The thin line of his supply fences, the outcrop where he'd stashed spare rations, vanished. Beneath a crawling steel, they swept the garden. The hover vehicles sent out little spider drones that cut through the snow like knives and left small, smoking craters where his panels had been. He moved with the children then, not out of bravery, not out of patriotism, out of the faint, stubborn thing inside humans that keeps them from letting the small die when they can push back. He strapped what he could to his back. Mazzari cradled Tiva. Cello took the carved soldier and slipped it into his pocket like an offering. The cabin sighed and went quiet as they stepped into the white. They slipped into the storm like ghosts, the wind covering their retreat. Elric led them across a map of false trails, humming a cadence to keep nerves steady. The locator on the door pinged in his ear. The machines had placed a beacon. The beacon would guide the enforcement back. It would not stop. Then, through the swirl of snow, he saw it. A faint wrong light that descended from the sky. A ship, not a patrol. A transport, and on its hull a sigil he remembered from evacuation. Bulletins, a crest of authority that meant detention. The sky itself was being drawn closed on them. Elric's breath fogged and cut cold. For a long, pure second there was nothing but the wind and the beating of his heart and the small, warm weight of Tiva against his chest. He could run. He could hide. He could let them take them and sleep again in the thin certainty of solitude. Or he could stand and make a choice that would echo farther than the cabin's thin walls. He chose to make them look up. Cliffhanger. As they dropped into a hollow to swallow their shapes, a flare blossomed above the ridge and the ship's voice cut the air. Target identified. Hostiles present. Prepare extraction. Hold the line. Steel your heart. The real fight begins now. The hollow they crouched in was shallow, no deeper than a fox's den carved by wind and time. Snow fell thick and soundless, muting the world into a single shade of white. But above that fragile silence, the machines roared. The ship descended with a predator's grace, its engines melting the snow beneath it into black water that steamed like the breath of hell. Its floodlights swept the ridge, burning away the night. Drones fanned out in careful arcs, methodical and merciless. Elric's instincts screamed trap, ambush, death, but the children's breaths were shallow against his chest. And Mazzari's eyes, golden and desperate, held him steady. He had been a soldier. He had been a ghost. But now he was something else, a wall between innocence and annihilation. The first drone sniffed the hollow. Its lens dilated, focusing. Elric triggered the jury-rigged EMP with a snap of wires. The blast ripped the air with a metallic crack, blue sparks cascading across the snow. The drone dropped like a stone, thrashing in the drift, its light flickering out. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then the sky screamed. The other drones pivoted as one. The ship adjusted, scanners recalibrating. They know now. They're coming! Run, Elric hissed. Follow the trail markers. Don't stop. Mazzari shook her head. You'll die. I already did years ago, he said. His eyes softened. Now move. She stared 1 second longer, then grabbed Cello's hand and bolted into the storm. Tiva clung to her like a star in orbit. Their small figures vanished into the white. Elric rose from the hollow. He had no armor, no squad, no command net in his ear, only an old revolver, half a magazine, and a scar across his face that reminded him what was taken. But he had anger. He had defiance. And for humanity, that ember had always been enough. He fired at the nearest drone. The bullet cracked its lens and sent it spiraling. 2 more closed in, their beams carving the storm into strips of light. He ran toward them, not away, shouting into the night with a voice that had once commanded men across burning fields. Come on then! The drones answered with fire. Energy bolts chewed the snow at his heels. His shoulder seared with heat as a shot grazed him, but he kept moving. He vaulted onto a half-buried outcrop, spun, and fired again. 1 drone shattered. Another dodged, recalibrating, but the ship was lowering. Its hatch cracked open, spilling cold light into the storm. Figures moved inside, enforcers, armored and tall, each carrying restraints. Not to kill, to take, to vanish. Elric's chest thundered with fury. His mind flashed to Tiva's trembling voice. Can I call you Papa? to Cello's sharp whisper. I'm not weak, to Mazzari's broken offer at his door. My children need a father. No, they would not be taken, not while he could still stand. He tore the last grenade from his belt, a relic. Scavenged, jury-rigged, but still lethal. He thumbed the pin and held it high, a tiny sun burning in the storm. The ship's floodlights froze on him, calculating, uncertain. One man, one grenade, insignificant. But humanity's defiance had never been about numbers. He roared into the storm, voice carrying farther than any machine could fathom. You want them? Come through me! The grenade sailed true. It struck the lead drone cluster and erupted with a bloom of blue fire. Metal shrieked. Snow vaporized. The blast rolled up the ship's hull, painting it with fire. For a heartbeat, the machine faltered, its systems reeling from the chaos of a single human's refusal. Elric staggered in the blast's wake. His revolver was empty. His chest burned. His knees shook. But he stood, scar blazing in the floodlight, defiance carved into his posture like a statue of rebellion. And then, salvation came not from strength, but from unity. Mazzari's voice cut through the storm, fierce and raw. Elric! From the ridge above, she and the children had circled back. Cello gripped one of Elric's old capacitors, wired to a crude detonator. The boy's small hands trembled, but his jaw was stone. Tiva clutched her doll, whispering courage into its stitched ear. And Mazzari, her hair wild in the wind, raised a scavenged rifle Elric had abandoned years ago. They had chosen not to flee. They had chosen to fight. The enforcers hesitated. Calculation faltered. Machines could not compute the weight of love, the math of sacrifice. Together they struck. Cello triggered the charge, frying another cluster of drones. Mazzari's rifle spat fire into the storm, precise and unyielding. Elric, with nothing left but his body, charged the last enforcer, slamming into it with the fury of a man carrying every ghost of every battlefield. They fell together into the snow. Metal screamed, flesh bled, but when the dust cleared, Elric was still breathing, kneeling in the drift, his fists slick with frost and fire. The ship reeled. Its engines flared, battered, retreating. The drones withdrew like broken teeth. In the distance, the crest of authority blinked and vanished into the storm. Silence fell again, heavy, crushing, but different now. Not the silence of despair, the silence of victory. Elric looked up. Snow fell soft against his scar. His family, his, stood above him. Cello's carving knife glinted. Tiva's doll waved its ragged arm as if in triumph. Mazzari's golden eyes met his, fierce and wet. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe. Humanity's ember had not only survived, it had spread, and the storm, which had once been a prison, now seemed to bow around them, humbled by the smallest fire in the dark. Mission not over yet, soldier, remember. Survival always demands one final choice. Mazzari reached for his hand. Cello straightened his shoulders. Tiva lifted her doll high as if offering it to the sky. And somewhere in the storm's retreat, it felt as if the galaxy itself paused, as if the void had heard the smallest fire daring to burn. Because humanity was never just fragile. Humanity was never just broken. Humanity was the spark that refused to die, no matter how dark the stars became. Remember this, soldier. The legacy of humanity is never forgotten.